Hello, my name is Jonas Wallstead, and I will be presenting our AP US History Unit 9 presentation made by Sydney Pell, Tracy Linton, Alex Gill, Ian Sinkowitz, and Jonas Wallstead. The first slide in our presentation goes over the prosperity of the Roaring Twenties. In 1908, Henry Ford introduced the Ford T model to the entire world. With time, the price to purchase the Ford T model went lower and lower in order for it to be purchased to a greater audience. This meant more cars for the common person and an easier way to get around the country and their cities. Because of the automobile and how widespread it was becoming, most of the general population no longer had to live near major places of transport like railways or stations. This, of course, led to, in later in history, white flight, where rich white people left inner cities, and behind them they only left poor, impoverished people, mainly African Americans. Throughout the 20th century, more and more American goods were being bought by the general public and across seas. This is because of their good quality and low price. This caused a large increase in the manufacturing industry in America. With the introduction of many tariffs by the US government, more and more European goods became expensive. This caused foreign trade to become less profitable than before and led to more of a desire for American goods. The introduction of inventions such as the automobile and the radio, which were groundbreaking at the time, made industries prosper and allowed for the creation of contributing market items. The First World War also played a large part in the prosperity during the 1920s and after. After the First World War, many of America's competitors, like Britain and France, were in ruins. This meant that America was able to dominate the market since their factories were intact and able to produce in large amounts. The introduction of the assembly line and mass production as a whole was a game changer for the economy. Factories were now able to build faster and cheaper than before because they did not need to rely on manual labor. This meant that there were more profits and more money in the economy. And finally, governmental policies were instrumental for the growth during this time period. Republicans were in charge of the government throughout the 1920s, and it was common policy for the presidents to support laissez-faire trade. This meant leaving the businesses and people alone. The government cut taxes for businesses and placed high import duties or tariffs on foreign goods. This helped the American industry grow and gave American makers more money. During the late 19th and early 20th century, industrial factories were being built in urban areas. This caused a lot of population growth in cities and decreased population in rural areas because people were driven by the jobs in the cities. Between the years 1920 and 1932, the agricultural economy went through an ongoing depression. The agricultural economy was, of course, greatly affected by the Dust Bowl, which lasted from 1930 to 1936, which made America's breadbasket essentially a desert and drove people away from the area and hurt the economy as a whole. Because of how bad the agricultural economy was, 1 in 4 farms were being sold just to meet financial needs. This caused farmers to leave rural areas and move to urban areas, which of course caused a huge problem for food production in the country. As a result of the Fordney-McCumber tariffs, the Emergency Quota Act of 1921, and the Origins Act of 1924, over 600,000 farmers went bankrupt during this time. America experienced rapid urbanization during this time and beforehand. The 50 years from 1870 to 1920, the number of Americans in cities grew from 10 million to around 54 million. The expansion of railroads in this time also helped expand cities, as rural people were able to move from their rural communities into larger areas. As previously discussed in the last slide, mass production of automobiles made them cheaper and more affordable to the common man, meaning they had an easier way to leave their communities. The urbanization of America was not all glamorous, however. Crime rates rose drastically in urban centers, and this is shown by the fact that the number of federal convicts increased 561% in this time. In the 1920s, income rose overall, but it was poorly distributed, meaning that a few elite people earned a lot of the money, and the common man did not see that much benefit during this time. Urbanization most profoundly affected the Midwest and Northeast, focusing on cities like Chicago, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. Our next slide focuses on the cultural movements that occurred during the 1920s and how they impacted society and the entire country. The Great Migration began around the early 20th century. marking a time when a significant amount of African Americans migrated from the rural South to the urban North and other areas like the West. The Harlem Renaissance period began in the 1920s as well. It was a time when African American culture in the North started to thrive in the northern parts of America. This was focused on the community of Harlem in Manhattan, where many influential black people gathered and spread their ideas. The Harlem Renaissance saw literary and artistic growth and recognition for famous and important African American artists. The Jazz Age was another movement in this time period, which led to the rise of jazz music and dances, no matter of color, such as the Charleston, which was a popular dance, and is credited to African Americans for its drastic rise in popularity. The Jazz Age reflected the social freedoms and expression that the post-war society of America could enjoy. Um, the Immigration Act of 1924 resulted in more Northern Europeans allowed in the U.S. than Southern and Eastern. The Flapper movement was also another important movement during this time, which focused on women's rights. After the 19th Amendment was passed, this allowed women to vote. Women, after this, began to pursue their own careers and leave the household. This period of dramatic cultural change in the status and rights of modern women became embodied by the Flapper fashion movement, which gave women more expression and more freedom. All of the growth and prosperity of the 1920s, however, led to one of America's darkest periods, the Great Depression, and there were many causes of this, including the government and tariffs. One cause of the Great Depression was that the economy was far too good and uneven in the 1920s leading up to the Depression. People were far too extravagant with their money during this time, and this led them to make purchases that they could not truly afford, taking out loans and going into debt. Businesses and manufacturers overproduced goods, which led to lower prices and the laying off of workers because they could not make enough profit to support themselves. This overproduction, combined with the large gap between the very wealthy elite and the consumer class, led to a decrease in sale of consumer goods as a whole. Access to credit from banks drove consumerism at first. However, it also reduced sales in the long run as installment plans were stricter and had to be followed more closely. The stock market crashed due to speculation stock price growth in October of 1929, resulting in a loss of $300 billion on a day called. This crash became infamous in American history and was called Black Tuesday because of its grave consequences to the economy and the common person. Throughout the 1930s, over 9,000 banks closed their doors. Bank deposits were uninsured, and thus as banks failed, people lost their savings permanently. The remaining banks, unsure of the economic situation and how they would be affected in the future, stopped being as willing to create new loans for people. This caused the economy to get even worse as no one could take out a loan. Another major cause of the Great Depression was American economic policy with Europe during this time. As businesses began failing, the government created the Smoot-Hawley tariff in 1930 to try and help protect American companies. This charged a high tax for import, leading to less trade between America and foreign countries, along with economic retaliation from said countries. The economic policies of Herbert Hoover were very important during this time. Herbert Hoover tried to take action while honoring his conservative views of volunteerism and optimism. His first step in trying to repair the American economy was to provide aid to the job creators. This is because he did not want to give out welfare to people who are not willing to work. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation included some trickle-down economics by adding loans to state and local government for public works to give people who are unemployed an opportunity to work. Hoover showed time and time again he was willing to spend money on government finance projects with a use to the community and able to put more people back to work. This was illustrated by the Hoover Dam, a massive project of building a dam in Nevada. These actions, however, did not help unemployment, and unemployment had tripled once Hoover decided to take real action, and his policies were seen as too little, too late, and the general public was not happy. In 1930, Herbert Hoover passed the Hawley-Smoot tariff, which imposed even higher tariffs on import. Hoover believed that this would force Americans to buy American goods, helping the economy and businesses, but the plan worked horrendously and backfires. Hoover also encouraged businesses not to cut wages or lay off workers in order to maintain individual purchasing power, which would help revive the economy. The plan failed due to reality that businesses could not continue to pay a constant wage while demand dropped to a level that lowered prices. Companies were eventually forced to lay off workers, which only created a higher unemployment rate and led to a spiral effect of damaging the economy again and again. Hoover desired a balanced federal budget, and instead of increasing taxes to increase revenue, he decided to cut taxes, which he believed would increase spending. This, of course, did not happen, and as the years went by, the common citizen was not happy and desired a new leader with more drastic solutions to the growing issue. Herbert Hoover was a long shot to win the 1932 election, as unemployment had increased 8 times and a 50% drop in the GDP had occurred over the previous few years. The Democratic Party went with New York Governor Franklin D. Roosevelt as their candidate for the presidency. Franklin Roosevelt won a landslide in this election, and the Democrats made major gains in the House and the Senate, giving them a lot more power than before in the government. This majority in both the House and the Senate, along with a rally effect, allowed the Roosevelt administration to pass more than a dozen major pieces of legislation in the first 3 months of his presidency. This became known as 100 Days, and is exactly what the people desired. The Democratic Party was also truly unified during this period, which contributed to their early success and drastic changes. The massive landslide of FDR showed the population's desire for great change, and the Roosevelt administration swept every region of the country except the Northeast, and carried many reliable Republican states that had not been carried by the Democrats since their electoral landslide of 1912, when the Republican vote was divided. When FDR became president, his main goal was to increase employment nationwide, and he also recognized the need for a support system for the poor. The Federal Emergency Relief Administration, started in 1933, addressed these urgent needs of the impoverished in America. However, the administration was shut down in 1935 and its work taken over by two completely new federal agencies, the Works Progress Administration and the Social Security Administration. Some other organizations started after the election of FDR were the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Agricultural Adjustment Administration, and the National Industry Recovery Act. All these agencies helped increase employment and gave people opportunities to make money and repair the economy as a whole. The main plan of FDR was to establish the New Deal, which implemented proposals of the 3 Rs: relief, recovery, and reform, which were meant to address the problem of the economy. A mandatory bank holiday implemented by the U.S. government closed all banks, and the Emergency Banking Relief Act sent inspectors to banks across the U.S. to build trust in the banks and make them able to give out loans again. The Glass-Steagall Act forbade commercial banks from engaging in excessive speculation and established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. Other examples of the first New Deal included the National Industrial Recovery Act, the Homeowners Refinancing Act, and the Unemployment Relief Act, which created the Civilian Conservation Corps. The first New Deal was revolutionary and was very successful. President Roosevelt inspired a new level of confidence in Americans. FDR was a reassuring and powerful leader whose fearless approach provided the psychological support that helped Americans get through the Great Depression and this horrific time. While the first New Deal was successful and helped drive down unemployment, it did not have its issues and had multiple missteps during its time. One of these missteps is the Agricultural Adjustment Act, which adopted the policy of destruction of crops and livestock that resulted in an increase of food prices by up to 50%. Large-scale unemployment continued throughout the Great Depression, and many of the jobs created by the New Deal were only temporary and implemented as short-term policy fixes. This did not establish long and reliable jobs that people could depend on for years to come. The second New Deal was much more liberal and addressed than the first New Deal. It improved use of national resources, security against old age, unemployment and illness, and a national work relief program. The Works Progress Administration employed millions of people to carry out public work projects nationwide. Other important programs brought into effect by the Second New Deal included the Social Security Act, which provided pension for the age and welfare programs. The Wagner Act defined unjust labor practices, secured workers the right to bargain collectively, and established a National Labor Relations Board. Perhaps the most important difference between the first and the second New Deal was that the second New Deal legislation relied more heavily on the Keynesian style of deficit spending than the first New Deal did. FDR altered his policy making in part because of complaints from critics and in part because by 1935 it was clear that more Americans still needed federal relief assistance. Because of the critics, Roosevelt aimed for approximately half of the second New Deal programs and policies to try to establish long-term reform and not short-term fixes. Because of the first and second New Deal, unemployment was driven down and quintessential American policies were established for years to come. After the Great Depression and World War II, America entered an amazing period of prosperity, and many of FDR's policies are still in effect today and help millions and millions of Americans. Thank you for watching our presentation, and we hope you now know more about the great rise and fall of America during this time period.